fundamentally, there's no difference really, whether you're introducing gene edits into a plant or into an animal. There's really no difference in terms of the risk. And as I outline, in terms of animal welfare, gene editing is very, very helpful because you can breed animals that are resistant to diseases that are deadly.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh and I'm the Head of Public Policy here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question to a top political and economic thinker. Today's question: how can Britain embrace bioscience? In one of the most significant post-Brexit divergences from the EU regulatory system, the UK government is preparing a new framework for gene-edited crops. But a new IEA paper said that while this is a welcome step, the UK should go much further in terms of embracing bioscience opportunities in agriculture. To discuss this topic, I'm excited to be joined by the author of that report, Cameron English, who's the Director of Biosciences at the American Council on Science and Health, and formerly the Managing Editor of the Genetic Literacy Project. Welcome to the IEA Podcast.
Hey, thank you, Matthew, so much. Nice to join you.
So let's start with the kind of good news story here in terms of what the UK government will be allowing post-Brexit. What is precision or gene editing? What's the science behind it, and how does it differ from GMOs?
Sure, very good question. Well, very broadly, precision breeding describes plant breeding techniques like CRISPR-Cas9 is probably the one people are most familiar with. But the basic idea is you can make very specific edits to the genomes of plants and animals. And so this speeds up the process. It allows you to discover new traits relatively quickly, and then get the seeds into the hands of farmers. And we can talk about some of the traits that have been developed and that are being developed, but it's everything from increased yields to disease resistance to drought tolerance. There's so many different traits that are being developed. But the basic difference between like CRISPR and these different precision breeding techniques and what people talk about when they talk about GMOs or genetically modified organisms is that you're not moving DNA between different species. That's typically the big distinction. And I know we can talk about this a little bit later, but that does concern some people. That it seems unnatural, it seems dangerous, and so forth, which I discuss in the paper. But that's the biggest difference is with gene editing, you're not moving DNA as much as you're just editing the existing genetic material of the organism. And so the plan for now is to, at least in plants, allow this technology to move forward if this precision breeding bill becomes law. And then a little bit later on, it'll be gene edited animals. And then hopefully, if we have our way, it'll be genetically modified organisms as well.
Yeah, so let's get a little bit more into gene editing. So as you've said, gene editing, relatively new technology. It enables you to kind of insert a specific gene into an organism rather than taking a gene from another organism and kind of mashing them together. What are some of the applications of gene-edited agriculture? What are some of the kind of good things that could come out of this for consumers, for farmers, for the environment?
Well, there's so many to talk about, but one of the recent ones that's in development is from British Sugar. They're working on a gene-edited sugar beet that is disease resistant, and this is a big deal. So there's a disease that's called virus yellows, and beet growers are very familiar with this. But the only way to control it right now is with insecticides that are very tightly regulated in the UK. So I mean they're effective, and ideally in an ideal world, farmers would have access to those. But if you have a disease-resistant sugar beet, then this is a huge step forward in controlling the problem. There's also been research at the John Innes Center. They've developed a vitamin D enhanced tomato. So this would be a consumer-facing trait. So you could buy this tomato; it would increase your access to vitamin D, which is surprisingly a very big problem. I believe it's 1 in 6 residents in the UK is vitamin D deficient. So
it's very cloudy here over the winter. Let me assure you.
That's right. Yeah. But again, that's a very practical example of how this could benefit consumers. And of course, you eat tomatoes already. I assume there are vitamin D supplements available as well. So if you can put this in a safe food, this is not a problem. So it's these kind of technologies that are very, very effective. But more importantly, if you can show consumers the benefits they're going to have access to, this tends to decrease their concern because they can see the value they're getting out of it. Whereas with the earlier breeding technologies with GMOs, these were farm focused, right? Insect resistance, pesticide tolerance, and so forth. Very important traits, don't get me wrong. But if you're the average consumer, you have a job, you have a family to raise, this doesn't mean that much to you. And so it's easier for certain activist groups, for certain political forces to say this is dangerous because you really don't know what you're looking at. But with a tomato that boosts your vitamin levels, you say, oh, that makes perfect sense. I think I'd like access to that.
Just noting also potential vitamin benefits kind of that usually are more associated with GMOs, which is that kind of broader sense of being able to have a crop that requires less water or might not require pesticides or can increase the yield and therefore increase profits to farmers, but also reduce prices to consumers, increase kind of agricultural productivity. Are there a bunch of gene editing applications along those lines as well?
There are, yeah. It depends on the trait. So and we don't have to get too technical, but there are some traits that are controlled by multiple genes, and it's very difficult to say to make like a drought tolerant crop with just gene editing. There have been there have been drought tolerant crops that have been approved, but quite a few of them are genetically modified in the sense that there's DNA that's been taken from one organism and transferred to another organism. And this is, by the way, technically this is called transgenesis, but this technology is used in multiple countries, right? So it's been approved in the United States. There's countries in South America as well that have approved this technology. And it's unfortunate that the debate has been framed the way it has, because people tend to talk about this and they think of genetic modification as this uniquely harmful or uniquely risky sort of endeavor that we're engaged in. And it's really not. I mean, anytime you breed any organism, you are modifying its DNA, right? Every person is genetically modified. Every crop, every animal is genetically modified, because when you breed an animal or a plant or what have you, you're shuffling all its DNA, and there's all sorts of mutations, and you can't predict them, and most of them are totally unintentional. But nonetheless, we eat most food, and we don't think twice about it. So I think it's unfortunate that we've sort of honed in on, if it's GMO, it's bad. That's the mistake, instead of focusing on the qualities of the food itself.
Yeah, I think there's probably an argument that gene edited crops or GMO crops, for that matter, even are actually more precise, more specific, actually less risky than traditional breeding techniques, in which, as you've said, there can be mutations and unexpected genetic implications that aren't necessarily well known or well understood. Kind of going more specifically, one of the things your paper looks at is just the way the UK will be regulating gene editing, not GMOs, gene editing, which is that I think it's worth re-emphasizing again, because it's something that can be lost, that gene editing is inserting new things into it. Now, the government's kind of moving on from the EU imposed regulatory system that regulated gene editing like GMOs and de facto bans both, to a system that is a little bit more risk-based. So just in terms of what you've for the paper, you looked into the regulatory system the UK government is proposing. I was wondering if you could describe that a little bit, and then maybe some analysis in terms of what you think that actually is going to mean. Is it liberalizing enough, or is it still potentially too precautionary and too risk adverse?
Sure. The way I put it in the paper is the precision breeding bill. It's an excellent first step, but that's all it is. So I don't want to be critical here. I want to stress that this is a very, very important step forward, because for almost 30 years now, the UK entirely has been sort of under the heel of the European Union regulations. So genetically modified crops, the older technology we were talking about earlier, strictly speaking, it's not outlawed. I mean, you can get approval for these, but it's extraordinarily difficult. And everything is treated that way. Any kind of breeding technique that isn't traditional breeding. So what this bill does is they use what they call a stepwise approach. So they start with gene edited plants. And the idea is that there's going to be two registration systems. One's going to be for research-based projects. The other one will be for commercial projects for the crops that farmers will actually be allowed to grow. But the basic idea is gene edited crops are going to be regulated more or less like traditionally bred organisms. And so this is good because, as we were talking a minute ago about a risk-based framework, this is good because instead of saying, well, this is gene edited, we made a very specific change to the DNA, therefore it needs this whole special regulatory pathway. You're looking at the organism itself and you're saying, okay, well, we understand what it's going to be grown for. We understand that it's not a risk to the environment. We understand it's not a risk to human health. And of course, all of those regulatory oversights are going to stay in place, right? You're going to have the Food Standards Agency is going to be looking at this. Of course, DEFRA is involved. So you still have lots of regulation. You're just not creating a whole special sort of oversight for gene edited organisms. So very good first step. And then later on, once the government is confident that the technology isn't a threat to animal welfare, they're going to allow it to be introduced into the commercial use of animal breeding. So good first step, but I think really what you need to do at this point, excuse me, is just open up everything.
Right up. Yeah.
Right.
Just to unpack it though a little bit more, is it precisely the same as what you would expect for I suppose any other food or any other kind of traditional breeding? So I noticed in the paper you discuss that there's going to be a whole kind of risk assessment process with the FSA. When it comes to other kind of novel foods, that is actually not a kind of red tape free process. There is quite a high regulatory burden that would be expected. Maybe rightfully so. I think you could make a reasonable argument that there does obviously need to be some level of regulatory oversight of this new technology, and that because there are potential consumer risks, and therefore the regulator taking this kind of approach is completely justified. But I'm interested in your thoughts. Is there a risk that, in theory, the government says, well, we're creating a more liberalized environment, but in fact, it will be very difficult to get anything through that more liberalized environment, supposedly more liberalized environment in the future?
Yes, I think that's always possible. I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase regulatory creep or mission creep. You get certain regulations and certain agencies that are that are established for one purpose, a very limited sort of role that they have, and then it expands. That's always possible. I think, though, there is enough support from the government and from the scientific community to get some sort of a liberalization in place. So I think something will happen. Obviously, we can't predict the future. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I would expect this to be some sort of a positive step forward.
Yeah.
I also discussed in the paper, there is a very vocal opposition. There's a segment of the organic food industry that's very critical of this technology. There are, of course, environmental activist groups who've taken up this cause ferociously over the decades, and they wield a lot of political power still. I mean, the European Union, they're looking at reforming their regulations too, but these groups are very well connected, and so they're pushing to block this. So that may influence the final version of the bill. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. It does seem like the bill as drafted will I think it's currently in the House of Lords committee stage. It's probably going to get through that, and it does seem like that bill will almost certainly become law. I think the question here, which is a bit uncertain, is how does this new regime operate in practice? As you've said, what are the kind of secondary systems introduced by the FSA as a regulator, and will that be friendly enough to innovation? So I think that's something that the next paper or the next look at is this system that, as currently designed, actually functioning as intended by the government, in a way that it's not currently designed, but as you've said a few times, you've referred to two specific I suppose recommendations or focuses of the paper where the government isn't necessarily going far enough. The first one is this question of gene editing in animals. Now, as you've said, this is something that's flagged as could come in the future. I think the government, I suppose, more for political reasons than anything else, is taking a relatively incremental approach to this technology. Are there concerns, though, in terms of gene editing on animals? And then obviously there are substantial concerns about CRISPR and gene editing on humans, as I think there was a case that was not properly regulated or approved in China a few years ago. What's the justification for kind of allowing gene editing in animals? Is it something that is risky or disproportionately inappropriate, and therefore there is a kind of justification for the government, or is it something that should be allowed?
No, it absolutely should be allowed. And the research is clear on this. I cite some of the studies in the paper, but fundamentally, there's no difference really, whether you're introducing gene edits into a plant or into an animal. There's really no difference in terms of the risk. And as I outline, in terms of animal welfare, gene editing is very, very helpful because you can breed animals that are resistant to diseases that are deadly. Now the pushback that you'll get from some activist groups and even from some people in the academy is that, well, this will allow farmers to, mistreat their animals. The phrase factory farming is very popular here in the United States. I'm sure you have that sort of rhetoric in England as well. But the idea is that if you have disease-resistant animals, it's going to allow farmers to mistreat the animals, right? They can raise them in mass in these terrible conditions, and so this isn't good for animal welfare. I would suggest anyone that believes that argument, just talk to a farmer, just talk to someone who raises animals for a living. They will all tell you without exception that it's good to raise animals in conditions that are comfortable and that are healthy for them, because they produce more when you take care of them, right? So mistreating your animals, abusing your animals, giving them unnecessary drugs, feeding them low quality feed, this is not good, right? If the animals are stressed and sick, they do not produce as much. Any farmer will tell you this. This is not my own musing. So in other words, if you give farmers access to this technology, they will be able to raise healthier animals. So that's the first thing in terms of animal welfare. But in terms of economic benefits to the farmers themselves, I mean, there are certain diseases that cost farmers and cost the industry in general hundreds of millions of dollars, because you have animals that die, you have animals that get sick and they need care. And so this is bad for everybody. It's bad for the animals, it's bad for the farmers, it's bad for consumers, because the higher the production costs, the higher the prices that are passed on to consumers, right? And I mean, you have a very economic literate audience, so they would appreciate that. So I think the goal of the paper, and I think our goal moving forward, should be to get the public to understand this, get the politicians to understand this. So this is good for animals, to sum up the situation.
Yeah, so if you can breed an animal that it allows you to not have to treat them in a terrible way, it's probably is great for them, more if they're disease free. I mean, that kind of logically leads to the next question, though, about CRISPR and humans, and it's something that kind of touched onto your paper, and you're very much focused on the agricultural questions. I'm wondering whether you do have any particular views when it comes to CRISPR and humans, and whether or not it is something that could potentially, we could breed humans in a precision way, in the way you just described with animals, where they don't have certain diseases, and it could actually be quite righteous to take such an action. Of course, it's not that simple in practice when it comes to CRISPR, that you can't just kind of turn on and off a gene and just expect a specific outcome without necessarily knowing what the unintended causes are. And it seems like a lot of diseases don't have like one gene that you can switch on and off. But in theory, at least, is that something that should be enabled, researched, or is it, playing God and totally inappropriate to start applying this technology to humans?
Yeah, very, very good question, but also a complex question. The first thing I would say is that these are two entirely separate issues. So using this technology in agriculture, I think, opens up certain questions, and there are certain levels of risks and certain levels of benefits that are worth discussing. On the human side, though, it's ethically fraught, and it's not good or bad necessarily, but this is just a whole nother issue. So I would be careful to separate that from what this paper is about. This is not about human gene editing. I will say briefly, in biomedicine, it has a lot of useful applications. So there are, for example, there are certain very rare disorders, genetic disorders, that are very difficult to treat. Maybe there's no treatment for them at all. Maybe you can manage symptoms. And so with certain gene editing therapies, gene-based therapies, you could potentially cure these diseases. Emphasis on potentially, right? You can potentially cure these. You can at least treat them better. So it has a lot of applications. Now, when you start talking about, breeding humans, or trying to create the next level in human evolution, I mean, this is a really complex question. Personally, I have some concerns, and a lot of that centers around, as a society, how do you judge when to use this technology and when not to use it? So there's different questions. Maybe I can come back and talk about that sometime.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But
There's some interesting kind of dystopian science fiction around this topic. Of course, it is something that's been investigated well beyond policy circles. And there's also there was an interesting argument from Toby Young in the UK a few years ago that he said effectively, if once this technology becomes accessible, it needs to be on the public health system because everyone should have access to it. You don't want a society that is stratified by those who are kind of rich, have access for their children to make them genetic super beings, and then a different segment of society who doesn't have access to that. And in terms of kind of the implications for inequality in that respect alone are quite fascinating, let alone, the fact of what it means in terms of human outcomes. So let's maybe leave some of those open, and we can have kind of an interesting future IEA paper on the kind of philosophical and moral questions raised by gene editing humans. Right now, though, I think you're right that the cost benefit analysis when it comes to agriculture and when it comes to animal gene editing are both overwhelmingly positive, and it's kind of welcome the government is moving in this step. A final kind of controversial point, and you've referred to it a few times in this discussion as well, is about GMOs and GMO when it comes to agriculture, the kind of Frankenfoods, scare stories that you hear about, something that EU's very much taken a precautionary approach about. You say controversially, I would think in many circles that, we're liberalizing gene editing, there's logically no reason not to also liberalize on GMOs. What's the kind of concluding argument there, the things to remember? What are the potential benefits of GMOs and what is the actual risk of GMOs?
Sure. Well, there's no really unique risk to genetic modification or GMOs, right? These products that they're produced through transgenesis, where you're moving DNA around. There's no unique risk. Now, what you need to do is you need to look at these products on a case-by-case basis. So, for example, if you have a crop that is tolerant to a particular pesticide, for example, that probably deserves a little bit more scrutiny, than a tomato with a little more vitamin D, right? Because at least hypothetically, there is some risk involved in some sort of technology like that. So the scientist who will object to that is few and far between, right? Most academics, most experts will say, sure, but that's a specific risk. It's not the way it was developed that introduces the risk. It's the fact that it is tolerant to a pesticide, right? So the key there is just focusing on the risk-based aspect of it. Now, in terms of benefits, I mean, the sky's the limit. We've already talked about drought tolerance. For farmers who can grow a crop that is herbicide tolerant, for example, it cuts the use of chemicals on farms. Same thing with insect resistance. I mean, this has been documented over and over again, and you can look at it in countries like India and Bangladesh, where the technology really makes a difference because they're using very, very harsh insecticides. They don't have access to the same quality products that farmers in England and the United States do. And of course, there's acute sickness that's associated with pesticide exposure, So there are benefits in terms of protecting the environment. I think everybody agrees that the more pesticide you use, the greater the risk to the surrounding environment, the greater the risk to human health. And of course, again, the cost to farmers is higher. So pesticides are expensive, right? They don't want to spray pesticides. So if you can give them another technology that reduces their dependence on chemicals, that's great. And you can do that with GMOs. So again, you can tackle this issue from all of the angles that the general public is going to care about, that a lot of these environmental groups are going to care about. And you can say, look, you want to reduce pesticide use? I want to reduce pesticide use. You want to promote public health? Hey, me too. We have so much in common. That's why
you want cheaper food. You want farmers to be more productive. You want less water use and less runoff. There's a lot of concern in the UK at the moment about runoff by water companies, and some that comes from farming as well, obviously, as well as sewage. So yeah, I think you're right. There's a whole range of benefits. Tick, tick, tick. It's win-win-win when it comes to GMOs in the same way as gene editing. But also, there's even this kind of broader moral argument that Matt Ridley, for example, I think has made quite persuasively about something like golden rice, So rice that's fortified with vitamin A potentially could save millions of lives in the developing world, and yet has been consistently blocked by Greenpeace on their kind of anti-GMO vendetta. And if you, whilst there's immediate benefits in the UK on the margins, there's massive benefits in the developing world of having access to healthier foods, having access to cheaper foods, having access to foods that are more productive and have less of a cost to consumers. So it just seems like it's ultimately a no-brainer that the UK could really lead the world on something like GMOs and liberalizing, particularly in comparison to the EU.
Without a doubt. And I mean, you and I have talked about some of the benefits before, but in terms of like environmental benefits, for example, globally, growing genetically modified crops has reduced carbon dioxide emissions. And this is a staggering figure, 34.2 million kilograms of CO2 have been kept out of the atmosphere since 1996 because of farmers growing these genetically engineered crops. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but there's less fuel use on farms. There's less pesticide use all around. And so this, if you're concerned about climate change, this is an enormous benefit. If you're concerned about the welfare of farmers, and this is one issue that everyone sort of pays lip service to, but then when it comes to the policy discussions, they're not that crazy about it. So when it comes to the economic benefits, we're talking about $1.7 billion worth of economic loss since 1996 because of restrictions on GMOs. I mean, these are hard figures, I think, for people to grasp. Like how much money is that? When you compare it relative to the size of your own bank account, I mean, these are staggering figures, and all it takes is changing the law in this case. A lot of our problems are not that simple, but we have the technology, we have the science to show that it's low risk to use. All we have to do is get our overlords on board, if you will.
It won't even cost the government a single dime. The Chancellor of the Exchequer can sleep just as easily at night after the legalization of all these great new biotech opportunities. Well, Cameron, thank you so much for joining the IEA podcast. It's been a pleasure speaking to Cameron Lesh, who's the Director of Biosciences at the American Council on Science and Health, about his new paper for the IEA, which if you're interested in reading, you can visit iea.org.uk. If you're enjoying the IEA podcast, please do subscribe on your chosen podcast provider. We'll be back in the new year. This will be our last podcast edition of the year. So Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy New Year, and all the best.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.